Good evening. As promised on today's newsletter, here is chapter 5 of Podkin One Ear, and this one is called Redwater. And we've just had an interlude, and the bard is getting back to the story. Well, as you so beautifully described, the fleeing rabbits had just toppled a tree on 2 Gorm riders. Very impressive too. After they stood there for a few moments, taking in what had happened, slowly realising they were still alive, they headed off into the woods again. The sun was well risen now, and they followed it eastward, crunching through the snow as drips from melting icicles pattered on their heads and ran down their necks, making them shiver even more. Before long, they stumbled down another bank and onto a narrow, frozen river. Paz, who actually had been paying attention in those geography lessons, recognised it as the Red River. This is the river that runs past Redwater Warren. Don't you remember it? Podkin was too cold to remember anything, even if he had been listening about river names and types of trees. The terror of nearly being caught and the amazement at the power of the star claw was gone. All he really wanted to do now was lay down in the soft white snow and fall asleep forever. But there was a dim little thought tugging away at the corner of his mind. Hadn't they used to come here at midsummer every other year? There'd been other little rabbits, hadn't there? And a dandelion salad with currant juice dressing. He was sure that he remembered that. Was it different then? Not white everywhere? Paz gave him a worried look and grabbed him by the arm. They half ran, half fell all the way along the riverbank until they came to an arched wooden bridge, and from there they followed a snowy track cut into the forest floor. It led them to a pair of oak doors set into the hillside. Notched Ogham writing carved into the gatepost declared it to be Redwater. "Thank the goddess," said Paz, tears in her eyes as she used the last of her strength to bang on the door. Podkin could do nothing but stand and shiver at his side, and little Pook was even too cold for that. After a few moments, the warren door creaked open and a ginger-furred guard rabbit poked his head out. Now Paz and Podkin might have been half frozen, but they had been here several times before, and they remembered the famous hospitality of the Redwater rabbits. Everyone for miles around knew how excitable and fun-loving they were. Any rabbit who stopped here was practically dragged inside and made to eat, sing and dance until they dropped, which is why they were shocked by this gloomy-faced, dreary soldier who peered at them now. His ears drooped. His eyes were shadowed and bloodshot. His leather armour was unlaced, unpolished, battered and torn. It barely fitted, hanging off him like old clothes on a scarecrow. If they hadn't been so frozen, they might have wondered why such a skinny, undersized rabbit was doing the job of a hardened warrior. "What do you want?" he said, not looking like he cared in the slightest. Paz could said something was wrong, but was too desperate to listen to her gut. She cleared her throat and spoke. "We need help, please." "The Gorm are after us," Pod added. "Soup?" whispered Pook, poking a shivering nose out of Paz's tunic. "We're from the Mumbury Warren," said Paz. "We're Chief Lopkin's children." The guard's eyes widened at this and he slammed the door on them. For an awful moment, Podkin and Paz thought they were being shut out, but then they heard the guards shouting for help through the doors. Are they going to let us in? Podkin asked through chattering teeth. I think so, said Paz. But something's up. We better hide the dagger. Podkin just looked at it dumbly, as if he was wondering how the thing had appeared in his hand. Quickly, Paz snatched it off him, wrapped it around with a cloth, and shoved it inside her tunic, next to Pook, who gave a weak little squeak of protest. She had just hidden it away when the door creaked open again, this time revealing a familiar face. Lady Russet, the Redwater chieftain's wife. Even though Podkin's brain was practically an ice cube, he could see the terrible difference in the lady. Before, she had been a plump, bristling bundle of life with zinging fur, a bubbling giggle and eyes that sparkled like glimmers of summer sunlight. Now, her skin hung off her face in folds. Lines of worry creased her brow. Her eyes were hollow, haunted and red-rimmed, as if she had been crying for a long, long time. When she spoke, her voice was light and happy, but it sounded forced, as though she was trying to hide some great sadness. Why, if it isn't little Paz and Podkin! How you've grown since the summer, and is this tiny Pook nestled here? You poor things, you look frozen half to death. It is true what my guard says about the Gorm in Mumbury Warren. Come in at once. You'll be safe here, I promise. Podkin knew this wasn't right, that he should probably turn and run back into the icy woods, but he could hear the crackle of a fire somewhere down inside the warren, and he could smell roasting parsnips and freshly baked bread. And at that moment, getting warm and eating were more important to him than anything else, even his safety. That might sound silly to you, sitting by a toasty hearthside with a belly full of turnip soup, but try spending the night running for your life through a midwinter forest. You would chew the legs of a rabid badger for a snack and somewhere cosy to sleep. In fact, warmth and food were more important than anything else right then. Although the little rabbits didn't know it, they were actually very close to freezing to death. If Podkin had laid down in that snowdrift like he wanted to, the sleep he drifted off in would have been his last. He would have woken up in the land beyond, and there is no coming back from that place. So that was how they came to enter Redwater Warren. Even though it was a mistake, Podkin would regret for the rest of his life. They were led through to the long burrow and sat down on benches next to the fire. Lady Redwater went off to see that their rooms were made ready for them, and some silent, shuffling serving rabbits brought out hot buttered parsnips and a few small loaves of bread. As soon as the blood started moving around his body again, Podkin's hands began to shake so badly he could hardly hold his plate. He managed to bite a parsnip eventually, and it burned and tingled as it slipped down his throat. It was the best feeling he had ever had. After a while, the shaking stopped, and he found himself gulping down mouthfuls and tearing through the bread like a starved rabbit. Paz was doing the same, and even little Pook even began to move around a bit. His nose wrinkled and his big eyes peered out from Paz's tunic. Neeps, neeps, he called, opening his mouth like a baby bird, as Paz spooned hot parsnips inside. As his body thawed out, so did Podkin's wits. He noticed the long burrow was dark and damp. Thick cobwebs filled the corners, and the fire before them was a tiny one, nestled amongst huge banks of ash. The fireplace hadn't been swept for months. He looked around at the tables and the benches, remembering the feast days of midsummer, when the hall had been packed to the rafter with cheery rabbits. There was hardly any furniture left now, and those chairs, had they been patched up? Was the back of that bench splintered? The food wasn't quite right either. The parsnips were stringy, the bread gritty and burnt on the outside. The last feast day they had eaten a huge, glorious meal. There had been a giant carrot, hollowed out so that when it was cut, a cascade of roasted turnips and swedes tumbled over the table. Now that was proper Redwater food, not this hastily cobbled together meal in front of them. Once he started noticing one or two little things, his eyes picked out more. Were those gouge marks on the earth wall there? What were those dried red stains spattered on the floor? And also, come to think of it, where were the children? The chieftain's children they had played hide and seek with and blind Bunny's buff with every year since he could walk. They were as nosy, loud and bubbly as any Redwater rabbit ever was. If they weren't in the Longborough itself, they should at least be able to hear them shouting and chasing each other somewhere in the warren. This was Bramblemas morning after all. There should have been a cluster of little rabbits in the Longborough, all showing off what the midwinter rabbit had brought them in the night. At least, that was always what happened in Munborough Warren. I had been hoping for a set of wooden soldiers, Podkin thought. He wondered if they had been delivered anyway and were sitting next to his empty bed, or whether the midwinter rabbit knew about the gorm and had kept away. It didn't seem important anymore, even though it had been all he had thought about for weeks. How quickly your life can turn upside down. Baz, he whispered, where do you think Rufus and Rusty are? Wouldn't have they come out to see us if they knew we were here? Paz nodded. Her eyes had been zipping everywhere, noticing the same things as Podkin. Mostly, she had been staring at a metal sculpture that she hadn't seen before, a tall iron pedestal that jutted up from the Longborough floor. It wasn't a model of anything particular, just a mass of twists and coils, all jagged, uneven and unfinished. Why do they have an iron statue in their warren? She said. Everyone knew that kind of metal was hated by the goddess, and what was it about the thing that set her fur on edge? It reminded her of something, but her poor, frozen, terrified mind couldn't quite place it. And then it came to her. The gorm. She wanted to tell Podkin but couldn't speak because 2 serving rabbits had just entered the room. They were carrying some kind of large box between them, covered with a thick blanket. They kept to the shadows as they edged their way around the Longborough. They had their heads down. But Paz could see them darting nervous, scared glances at them as they passed. Out through the hallway to the main doors they went. When they were gone, she hissed at Pod. What was that they were carrying? Pod was about to shrug when he heard a muffled, cawing sound coming from the hallway. Some kind of animal, a bird. That sound. They had heard it before, just a few short hours ago. Podkin and Paz looked at each other, but thinking the same thought at the same time. It's not a box, but a cage. And inside must be one of the gorm's spy birds, a warped, tortured crow with dead eyes and rusted metal feathers. The bird, the statue, the dead, empty warren suddenly all made terrible sense. They're working for the gorm, Podkin said. They're letting them know we're here. The gorm must have taken Redwater just like they had taken Munbury. Chief Russet must have been killed, his guards murdered, and the rest of the warren turned into slaves. And as for the children, Podkin didn't like to think. Without its heart and soul, the warren was slowly dying. They had chosen the worst possible place to run to. We have to get out, Paz started to say, but Podkin was already up and running. She grabbed Pook and went to follow when, from the corner of her eye, she caught the sight of the iron pillar. Something inside it had squirmed, jutted like a fat eel stuck to a shallow puddle of mud. Could that even be possible? And then it made a sound, a grinding, screeching wail that grew louder and louder. She didn't stop to hear any more. Clutching Pook, she dashed after her brother as fast as the quick rabbit legs would carry her. They sprinted out of the long burrow in the opposite direction of the main entrance, just as a shout went up from the gallery above. Someone had been up there watching them, and from the voice it sounded like Lady Russet herself. "Stop them! Don't let them escape!" Into the tunnels of the warren they ran, the screams echoing behind them. Heading away from the main doors, they have seemed a daft thing to do, but Podkin knew there would be guards there. He also knew warrens had many little back entrances and bolt holes. He could hear his father's voice reciting one of his favourite phrases. A warren with only one entrance is basically a trap like the one they had just walked into. They dashed through the dark, winding corridors, changing direction every time they heard footsteps nearby. The Redwater rabbits were closing in on them, hounding them through the tunnels like ferrets used to chase their small, fluffy ancestors. Shouting voices echoed behind them, and little Pook began to wail as he was bounced around inside Paz's tunic. "Neeps! Neeps!" He could sense his sister's fear, but he was also very concerned that his meal had been interrupted. "There," Paz shouted. Up ahead!" The tunnel had become lighter, and as they ran to the corner, they saw a small open gateway and the snowy frost beyond. They sprinted for it as fast as terrified rabbits can, as Lady Russet's voice called out behind them, "Seal the warren! Close all the gates!" Slams and bangs began to echo through the passageways with numb horror. Podkin saw a metal door begin to grind towards over the doorway ahead. Their escape was being blocked. They were going to be trapped inside. Sometimes, when your life is in real danger, when everything seems lost, there is, an energy deep within you that you give one final desperate surge of power. It isn't always much, but often it's just enough to scrape through trouble by a whisker. Podkin and Paz reached for theirs now and doubled their speed down the tunnel as the heavy grille clanked further and further down. Paz reached it first and dropped to her knees, sliding underneath the door prongs and out into the snow. Podkin was a split second behind her. He copied his sister, kicking his legs out and falling backwards to skid underneath it. Looking up, he saw the roof of the tunnel pass by, the gateway, the falling door, and then the grey sky of the open air above. "I did it," he thought. "I'm free." But then came a sharp, searing pain in his ear. He tried to get up, but something was holding his head down, something very painful. He heard Paz scream, and he twisted round to see what had happened. The door was down, and there, on the outside, or at least most of them was, one of his long, silky brown ears was still inside, and speared through it, holding him in place, was a prong of the door. He had been pinned to the ground. He was trapped. I think we might be just going to find out why Podkin only has one ear. See you soon. Bye.